Welcome to the class on research design. My name is Nishesh. So let's begin. So first of all, the question is, what is research design? So now I want you to be thinking about this question. What does research design mean to you? Research design basically is a blueprint. So you've heard of research questions and you've heard of answers that are based on those research questions. But what happens in between that research question and that answer? So everything, all the steps that happen in between those is basically research design. So it's a blueprint of how you are going to answer your research questions. So for today's class, we're going to talk about many different kinds of research design that we can use. And here's a quick overview. So I've grouped them. You can group these in many different ways, but I've grouped them in two different ways. So one is non-statistical and another is statistical. So what that basically means is, in non-statistical, the research is not done on a group of people or group of something, group of objects, let's say. And in statistical, the research is always done on a group of people. So statistics, when we mention any kind of statistics like mean, median, that always represents a data based on a group of people or group of agencies or group of any kind of objects. So we'll first talk about the non-statistical, and we'll specifically talk about two types of non-statistical, and then we'll talk about two different types of statistical techniques, research designs. The first one is, the non-statistical, we can think about case studies and single subject design. And these are non-statistical because they focus on a particular individual or a particular system. And both of them are very good for applied research that we social workers do. So first of all, case studies. What is a case study? So a case study always involves an in-depth description of a particular person or a system. So now you might think, oh, case study, why would you do a case study just based on one person, right? But think about somebody like president of a country or president of a really large institution. You could, or a governor of a state, you could do a case study on that person and learn a lot about how decisions are made, how things are structured. And case studies are mostly done on systems, though. So however we define a system, we can think about our agencies that we work in or you intern in as systems. So a case study would involve research about that agency and the different parts within that agency and how these different parts interact with each other. Can have multiple cases, so you don't need to just have one case. You can have two different cases and then compare them to talk about what are the differences and similarities. So again, going with an agency example, you can have, let's say, two agencies that provide services for people who are homeless, but one has a particular service delivery model and another one has a different service delivery model. So your case study design could look at those two cases and compare them. The idea is you are telling a story. You are telling a story about an individual or about a system. And case studies is not just about qualitative or quantitative. Most of the times people collect both quantitative and qualitative data for a case study. So for example, in a case study in an agency that provides services for people who are homeless, you can do a survey of all the staff in terms of their satisfaction with the services they provide or the satisfaction with their salaries or any kind of different things. You already kind of learned about what descriptive, explanatory, or exploratory research is. So case studies can be used at any of these three types of research. So you can use to describe a particular system, how that system works, how that system doesn't work. You can explain things. So for example, if the agency that we've used as an example has a really high success rate for its clients, then you can ask the question of why does it have such a high success rate? So you can do a case study on that agency, trying to understand why does this particular agency have such a good success rate, and your study could help other agencies replicate the same processes. So that would be explanation, you're explaining why. And you can also do exploratory. Sometimes issues are complex, and when we think about case studies, we can think about also in terms of neighborhoods or cities or states. So sometimes those can be vast and complex. And for example, let's say, not thinking about an agency, but let's say we talk about homelessness in the Twin Cities. So now that feels, it's a huge topic. I know there's other studies being done, but you can use the case study format to begin to explore that idea of the issue of homelessness in the Twin Cities. And one of the defining features of a case study is its holistic approach. And as social workers, we understand that people are in environments, and that different parts of the system interact with each other, and the system determines the behavior of individuals and other systems. So this holistic approach, what it does is, instead of focusing on one individual in your research, or a group of individuals even, you focus on the individual and the environment that surrounds them to fully understand both the person and the context. So case studies are really useful and aligns well with the person in environment framework. One of the important things about case studies is how do you select those cases? Because remember, this is a non-statistical technique, so you are not collecting data from a bunch of people and generalizing it to the population again. So in case selection becomes very important. So you can think about case selection on many different bases. So you can think about a typical case. So you can think about there are, let's say, 20 agencies in the Twin Cities that provide services for the homeless, and we want to study one agency. How do you choose that agency? That becomes a difficult problem, right? So one thing you can do is choose the most typical of agencies. It's like they don't do a lot of things differently. They are like the median or the mean agency that can be representative of various agencies. Another one you can do is pick an agency that has a very different service model, because that will give you information about how things are run differently. And you don't have to have just one case, so you can have two cases, one that is a typical case and one that is an outlier case. Another case study that is interesting is event-based cases. So any kind of an event that happens naturally, and naturally we can think about natural disasters like flooding, earthquakes, and what happens after those events is always an interesting case. Or you can also think about policies. Once policies are implemented, then agencies try to adapt to those policies, whether it's budget cuts or having to do extra paperwork to fulfill some kind of new rule. So event-based cases are also a good way to choose a particular case for your case study research. Okay, so we're moving on to single subject research design. Single subject research, we talked about case study, we use both qualitative and quantitative methods, but single subject design is a quantitative method, and it is used to understand how behaviors of individuals change over time. And this is good for applied work because it can be used to understand where a client is improving or not. And again, because of focus on one individual, we cannot generalize this research and say, oh, if this is done, it'll help other people also. Becomes tricky. If you do this kind of evaluation over, let's say, like long period of time with multiple people, and you have strong evidence that aligns with all the different people throughout time, then you have a more robust research result. So at this point, let me try to show you what a single subject design looks like. So in a single subject design, you always think about two things are important. One is that it's for one individual and most of the times one behavior, and that it's always over time. So the easiest way to think about it is through a graph. And on the graph, this is the time. So now this time can be all the weeks of services you provide, right? Let's say it's a 12 session of intervention, any kind of intervention. So you start out 0, then you go up till, let's say, 12. This is in weeks. And then you are tracking a particular kind of behavior, let's say stress. Or stress that a person is under. And let's say you have a particular stress instrument that asks 10 questions, and if you score 10 out of 10, you are super stressed. If you score 0 out of 10, then you are not stressed at all, right? So in our stress scale that we just invented, we have it at 10 and 0. So what you do is you first take a baseline for some time to understand where that person is before your intervention actually begins. So let's say this person is at 7, and that person remains at 7 for a particular, let's say till 4 weeks. You've been gathering data, building rapport, and understanding the level of stress. And this will probably not look like a straight line, right? So it will probably like go up and down a little bit. But for simplicity, we'll just draw straight lines. And then at the 4th week, you began your intervention. And as you do your intervention, you are still collecting data to see what is happening with stress. So now, let's say stress, and it begins to decline. At this time, it's like 3 or something. Right? What would you conclude after, let's say, 8 weeks? The stress level has gone from 7 to 3. You would be pretty happy about it. You'd be like, oh yeah, I think this thing is working, because I took a baseline for 4 weeks and it was hovering around 7, and once I started my intervention in the beginning, there was not a lot of difference, and after a couple of weeks, then it started to go down. I think my intervention is working really good. So in your textbooks, if you read, this is called an A-B design, right? So this phase is called A, this phase is called B. So A is the baseline and B is the intervention phase. But you have a friend who's very critical and says, well, how do you know that this decline is because of what you did and not what is happening in that person's life elsewhere? And remember, single subject design, unlike case studies, are just like honed in on that one person. And they might ask a little bit about what is going on, but that's not really the focus. In case studies, what is happening in the environment is also one of the primary focuses, and not just the person. So that person, the therapist or the researcher, doesn't really know what that individual is going through. Maybe the individual was going through a breakup here, right? High stress. And here, somehow they figured out that they'll work things out, and so that person becomes less stressed out. So is it the intervention, or is it something that is happening outside of the intervention that is changing that person's stress level? So one of the things that you can do to make your findings more robust is then remove the intervention, right? So at this point, let's say you stop doing the intervention, the actual therapy, and then but you keep recording the level of stress, right? So at this point. So let's say, there are different scenarios here. Let's say the stress level keeps going down. What could this be? Why did, without the intervention, the stress keeps going down? If you're a person providing an intervention, you're probably like, I'm not sure about my intervention anymore. But it could be that through the intervention, that person kind of learned some ways to change their behavior, and so that they kind of implemented that even beyond your direct intervention. Or it could be that, yes, the stress level was truly changing because of this person's outside environment, and then outside environment is very supportive and it's not adding stress, so it keeps declining. Or you could happen where, like, once you stop the intervention, it begins to go up. Right, so at this case, now again, you can be like, well, see, my intervention works, because once I stopped doing the intervention, the stress level goes up again, and that's good, good result. Not good, the robust study design, and the result is trustworthy. But one thing you can be doing is kind of collecting information about what else is happening in that person's life, as like collect qualitative data about what else is happening, so that you have some context about why you are seeing this up and down. Is it anything else beside the intervention that is contributing to this kind of behavior? So now you can think about doing this with 2 people, 3 people, but it's very hard to do with a lot of people because it's very resource intensive. It takes a lot of time. Again, it's very good for an applied research, applied evaluation, because if you have people with certain issues and you're providing an intervention, you want to know whether that intervention is doing any good or not, right? That's the ethical aspect of doing evaluation. Okay, let's move on. So this is kind of just summarizes what I just mentioned, is used to determine whether a participant intervention has the desired effect or not, and then involves collecting data several times over a particular time period and comparing the result with past, present. So we talked about measurable client objectives, measurable outcomes. So when I put the stress on the y-axis, and what that shows is that you need to have a certain aspect of the behavior that is measurable. That is your goal. So if your goal is, you need to have a goal where it's like, oh, the stress will be reduced by 50%, or stress will be reduced to this level, and have an actual instrument that can measure it. That's very important. And then graphically displaying results. In single subject design, most of the results are shown graphically, because it it makes sense. If you like start writing about those results, it's more difficult to write, and in a graph it makes it's much easier to understand. So independent variables and dependent variables. So in single subject design, independent variables are the variables that the researcher or the therapist is or the counselor is manipulating, and the dependent variable is whatever the outcome is. So you can think about the light switch. In the light switch, or like if you have a dimmer or a volume controller, that's your independent variable because you can change it, right? And how loud the sound is your outcome variable or your dependent variable. So that's always, you can always think about like the independent variable is something that affects the dependent variable. So here's a quick example. I'll let you read it. So one-on-one support, which is the program, is the independent variable. The programs that you provide in your agencies is always the independent variable, and the outcome of that program on participants is the dependent variable. So in this case, it's the score on a depression scale. We've already talked about this, what A represents and B represents. So the most basic single subject design is called AB. Again, A is like the baseline when you are not providing the intervention, just collecting data, and B is the effect after you have provided the intervention. Measurements of the dependent variable, right? In our case, it was stress. It's always taken over time, and it's represented graphically. So this is kind of, again, talking about what I already showed you. So in this case, it's AB design. So what they did is basically have the baseline phase, the intervention phase. They pulled the intervention to see if there is any impact, and then after that you give the intervention again, because from an ethical perspective, you cannot really pull the intervention and leave the person like that, even if they are doing fine. You might want to, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, so you might want to end with the intervention phase, because that's why they came to see you in the first place. Again, we've already talked about this, and so you can do single subject design across participants. So you have, let's say, 5 or 6 participants, and for all of them you are measuring the same stress scale on the stress scale. You can do across problems, so you could have one participant but you are measuring different things, stress, depression, other things. And across settings, you can, if you are a therapist that let's say provides mental health care for children, you could be providing it in a clinical setting, in a school setting, in a home-based setting. So across those different settings, how is the outcome different? So you can do multiple cases within single subject design. I covered that. Basically, the bottom line, the reason of doing multiple baselines is that it helps the investigator study effect of particular intervention on multiple people or multiple settings. So in single subject design, we are kind of talking about one person, but kind of try to think about how you can utilize single subject design at a more macro level also. So on a more macro level, you could do it where it's an agency or a community, where, let's say in an agency, there is let's say, pay for performance or something like that. So if you perform well based on some indicators, you get paid more. And it doesn't happen in nonprofits a lot, but in the corporate sector, there is a lot of pay for performance models. So you could do where in the beginning you rate the job satisfaction, and then you start the pay for performance intervention and see how that job satisfaction changes, and then you remove the pay for performance to see how the job satisfaction changes after that. Or at a community level, you can first take a baseline for any kind of issue, then provide the programming, and then remove the programming, and then see how things change. So single subject design, the subject piece could either be an individual or even an agency or a community. But the challenge is that by the time you are thinking about agency or community, you are more moving towards the case study aspect, because you want to be thinking about different factors within the agency and outside the agency and the agency's environment also. So think about your internships, past jobs, past jobs, and think about how you could use the single subject design to conduct research or evaluate any kind of intervention that you might do. And some of the specific questions for that would be, what is the measurement or assessment tool that you can use and document a particular behavior over time, right? What would you measure and how would you measure it? And how frequently can you take the measurements? Is it going to be every week, every day? Can I collect the data in several different ways? So this idea of triangulation is very important in research. What triangulation means is collecting data from different perspectives so that your results are more robust. So if you just collect, let's say on that stress tool, you just use the stress tool to collect data about stress, then that's one perspective or one vantage point. You could also collect qualitative data on how that person thinks about stress, how stress affects them, what things stress him out, and then also qualitative data about what are the things happening in his or her environment that would make the person more stressed or less stressed. You can also do not just collect data, but also do observation of behavior, nonverbal behaviors, and try to bring together all that data to form your conclusion. And other things that that you need to be kind of be thinking about is who will collect the data. Will the client self-report? So if it's a stress scale and the client says, today I'm feeling 7 versus today I'm feeling 3, then that is the client self-reporting. Now you have to think about what are both the pros and cons of doing that. Would like other people or family members be collecting data? So if you can think, if it's a child and an infant, or maybe even like 2-3 years or adolescents, would like the family collect data on that person's behavior? And is it you, like as a social work practitioner, are you the one who is recording data? So depending upon who is recording the data, you will have different challenges, different pros and cons. This is an interesting issue, is when we do research, we have ethical aspects of research, and so we go through the institutional review board, we get their approval, we have certain like informed consents, like we have certain process to ensure ethical standards. But if you are a social worker practitioner collecting data and doing research within your agency with your client, then what are some of the ethical concerns you might have? You have ethical concerns when you are just providing practice, But when you are collecting data, and even in single subject design, sometimes removing the intervention, what are some of the ethical consequences? So you have to be thinking about that. Is removing the intervention ethical if it is working, right? If it's helping, is it ethical to remove the intervention? But that's the point, is that you are trying to find out if it is working or not. Some pros, it's relevant because it's practice related. It's not like some big research study done with like hundreds of students in a big college or something. So this is done in a practice setting. We can change course in the middle of the evaluation, right? So you can like provide intervention, not provide intervention. The results are readily applicable, so we can have like, oh, I did this particular intervention, and for this person, these kind of things work. So within your circle of colleagues, you can be sharing that, and those results are very applicable. It doesn't require a lot of extra time and effort in some sense, because unlike other research studies, when you have to like have people collect a lot of data, analyze it, it requires more time and effort. But here you are doing this in your practice setting and collecting extra, and some data you might already be collecting, but you are doing it in a particular systematic manner, so it may not take a lot of extra resources. Some of the critiques are that it's not generalizable because you're just doing it with one or two people. It takes time away from direct practice, so instead of like focusing just on your practice, maybe you are focusing on the research aspect of it. Does not take into account confounding factors. So confounding factors are all the factors that might affect how the intervention works or not. So the example that I gave about relationship issues that the person might be having that might be causing stress would be a confounding factor. And then this is, would it work for all types of interventions? So can you apply single subject design for all kinds of interventions? So just think about all the interventions or you've seen been applied or you learn about. Can you apply single subject design? And sometimes the answer is no, because depending upon what kind of intervention is, you may not be able to collect data. There may not be actually like particular measurable goal that you are looking at. So single subject design may not be applicable for all kinds of interventions. And all kinds of issues either. There are probably a lot of issues where you cannot even think about pulling the intervention out to see whether it works or not on that particular individual. We've talked some of these points already. One of the most important one is that the design focuses too much on individuals without thinking about the context. Okay, so now we kind of want to move into the group design or the statistical design. So in a group design, the outcome of the study is always reported as a statistic of a group, right? When you think about mean is a statistic based on a bunch of other numbers relevant to each individual. So first we'll talk about an experimental design. And again, let me build this. So in an experimental design, what happens is let's take a example of tobacco prevention, right? Sorry, not tobacco prevention, but the use of tobacco and its relationship with cancer. And so you cannot ask people to start smoking to see if it has cancer or not, right? So because that's an ethical issue. So what you would do is begin with a group of people that both smoke and don't smoke. So let's say this is a study in the Twin Cities. Let's took Hennepin County, right? So everybody in the Hennepin County is involved is within this population. So now you want to you probably want to limit people of like certain ages, right? Maybe like take from like 18 to like 55 or something like that. So have some parameters. And then out of that population, you randomly choose select a particular sample. So now we are into the statistical approach, right? So we want to be able to generalize back to the population, and the reason we do random selection is that whatever result we find based on this sample, we will generalize it back to the population. So once you have that sample, then now you want to have a certain group of people. So you want to divide this sample again randomly into treatment. You want to divide them into a treatment group and a control group. Oh, did I say, sorry, I think I started the example as like connection between tobacco and cancer. That's a later example. So this would be, let's say, any kind of intervention. Let's say particular medicine, particular pill to cure a particular kind of disease, right? I'm running out of examples. So in your treatment group, you would have this group of people will get the medicine. And this group of people will not get the medicine. And you can make it more complicated where you have three groups where one gets the medicine, another gets just a placebo, like a sugar pill or something, and then one group that doesn't get anything. And then you collect data on them after some time, depending on the any kind of disease or what kind of medicine it is. And then you want to find out what is the, so here you will have some people who went through the treatment that don't have that disease anymore, and some who still have that disease because it's not going to work 100%. Let's assume that this thing works. Some still have the disease, it didn't work for them, and some that the medicine works. And then in control, maybe let's say some of the control group also don't have the disease anymore because for some reason the disease went away. And then other group of people, they still have the disease because they didn't receive any medicine. So now what you want to do is you want to find out whether the proportion of people who got the treatment and that were able to get rid of the disease is that higher, significantly higher than the number of people who were in the control group but don't have the disease after this particular phase. So the basic idea is that you have a random selection, you get a particular sample, and then out of that sample you have a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group gets the medicine, it could be intervention. I worked in a project in India where we gave families a new kind of cook stove that doesn't pollute that much. So it could be any kind of intervention. So once they get the intervention, they are in the treatment group, and later you want to find out if they have significantly better outcomes than people who didn't get anything, right? So if they don't have any significantly improved outcomes than this, then that means whatever the intervention was didn't work properly, right? So the power, this is a very powerful research design. It's very expensive to conduct. It's very complicated to conduct. The power comes really from this idea of random selection, randomly selecting who is going to be in the study. And here also you have a sample and you randomly select who goes into the treatment and who goes into the control. And then you have these two groups where one receives treatment and other doesn't receive any kind of treatment, and then you are comparing the two outcomes. And whatever result you find here, then you can generalize it back to the population and saying that the results of this study is applicable not only to this study but to this overall population. So here's a list of things that are important, right? First of all, random sampling. If you don't randomly sample, then you don't have any power in your results, because you could have a very biased sampling if you like pick and choose who can be in the study. Time order of independent variable. So what that means is that the independent variable, in this case, that any kind of intervention, whether it was the medicine or the cook stove or any kind of health intervention, must come before the dependent or the health outcome, right? So you introduce the intervention first and the health outcome or any kind of outcome comes afterwards. Changing the independent variable. So you need to be able to change the independent variable. So same example with the volume control. Volume control is a good example of independent variable because you can change the level of volume, right? So in this case, it's like you are able to give the medicine the intervention, so you are changing that independent variable. Having a control group is a must for. If you don't have a control group, it's not really an experiment. There are other designs called quasi-experimental design which don't really have a control group. And then you also need to understand the effect of extraneous variables. So you could be in a treatment group and you get certain medicine, but maybe there are other things happening outside that makes your outcomes not improve as much. It's the similar example with like the single subjects, where whatever is happening in the context is influencing the effect of your intervention. Okay, so now this is probably the most common in social research, non-experimental or observational. So one of the first ones is pre-test, post-test. So all that means is kind of similar to the single subject design, where you have let's say a group of people that are participating in, let's give a simple example, in a workshop, right? So you do a pre-test where before they take the workshop, they fill out a particular kind of assessment. And after they take the workshop, they fill out that assessment again, and then you can match the change because of them taking that workshop. So like, how has their like knowledge changed? How has their understanding changed? So pre-test and post-test is a pretty common way of understanding if there's been any kind of change or not. And you can do this in your agency context, where you do during intake, you might do an assessment of a person, and then towards the end, when you are about to terminate that case or close that case, you might do assessment again, and then you want to compare the pre and post. The pre and post is it's pre-intervention and post-intervention, and then you compare the data. Cross-sectional survey design, you might have filled out a lot of surveys. It's basically cross-sectional means one point in time. So instead of looking at different time intervals, you are just looking at one time. So like if you have the question, what is the prevalence of homelessness in Minneapolis? That's a and then the answer comes, there were 20,000 people who were homeless in 2015. That's cross-sectional, right? Because it's talking about one point in time. And then there's longitudinal studies. So now longitudinal studies means you are following a person or group of people over time. There are different ones. There are trend studies, cohort studies, and panel studies. So that is an example of cohort studies. So trend studies are basically, you are looking at trend of any kind of a social issue, right? So if you look at homelessness, a trend of homelessness in the past 20 years in the Twin Cities, and then why that trend has like gone up and down, that's kind of like, it's a trend study. And then panel study is you are basically following, not following a group of people, but let's say the prevalence of bullying in third grade. So people will come into third grade, you measure bullying, and they move out, and then more people come into the third grade and they move out. You are not necessarily following the same group of people, but you are looking at third grade for multiple years, right? Or it may be like fifth grade or seventh grade, but you are looking at a particular behavior for different groups of people. And then cohort studies is kind of probably the most popular one, and it's sometimes you cannot do an experiment, so cohort studies are also very strong when you cannot do an experiment. So I was trying to give that example earlier about tobacco and cancer, right? So in a cohort study, what you would do is you would find a group of people that are currently smokers. So you will find a group of people that are smokers. So again, this comes from a larger population, randomly selected based on criteria of whether you are a smoker or not. So if you have a list of smokers and you randomly pull from that list, and you have a group of smokers for your study. Similarly with non-smokers, you have a list of non-smokers, and then you randomly pull, and then you get a group of non-smokers. And then what you do is you start to follow them, and follow them meaning like you collect data over a period of time. Let's say 5 years, 10 years, and these are also expensive because you have to like follow up, and then finding the same people again and again to collect data can be very expensive, right? So you are collecting data at different points. So now at the end of your study, what you will find is that a group of the smokers developed cancer, and the group out of that group, some did not develop cancer, right? And then you have non-smokers, and out of that non-smokers, some developed cancer and some did not develop cancer. And so now what you want to find out is that whether in the group of smokers the prevalence of cancer is significantly higher than in the group of non-smokers. Let's say we have 100 smokers, 100 non-smokers, and 50 in smokers developed cancer, 15 non-smokers developed